Hello, my friend, and welcome. Before we begin tonight, I invite you to prepare your space for rest. Find a position that feels soft and comfortable. If you can, dim the lights or turn them off completely, so that the only glow you notice is a calm glow from your screen or the sound of my voice. I would love it if you could share in the comments where you're listening from and what time it is right now. It amazes me to think that this video can travel across oceans and time zones, reaching people in all corners of the world. If you enjoyed this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It helps the channel grow and ensures that more people can discover a place of rest, just like you have. My greatest wish is that you won't hear this video all the way through, because somewhere along the way, you'll drift into deep and restful sleep. That's the outcome I hope for every time. And if there's a particular subject or theme you'd like me to cover in future videos, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments. Your suggestions mean so much. Allow yourself to relax, and let's begin. Throughout history, there have been figures who lived on the very edge of society, yet walked in the innermost circles of power. They were both feared and trusted, despised and revered. They were men set apart, sometimes against their will, sometimes by their own choosing, whose bodies bore the mark of one of the most extreme sacrifices imaginable. These were the eunuchs. To modern ears, the very word carries shock, curiosity, perhaps even discomfort. That kind of society would take young boys, remove from them the very source of manhood, and then raise them to guard kings, queens, harems, and thrones. And why, despite this mutilation, did eunuchs so often rise to unimaginable heights of wealth and influence? From the palaces of Mesopotamia to the forbidden city of China, from the glittering courts of Byzantium to the hidden chambers of the Ottoman harem, eunuchs stood at the ultimate paradox. They were the voiceless, given voices in state affairs, the powerless, who became kingmakers, and the outcasts who became indispensable. But how did it begin? Why were boys selected for this fate, and who chose them? What did the brutal castration process involve? And how many survived it? Did these men, cut off from ordinary life, still fall in love, still dream of family, still feel the pull of human longing? And what of those bold enough to pretend, feigning castration to slip into the inner courts? This is the story of the eunuchs, a journey across empires and centuries, where pain and power meet, where mutilation was turned into opportunity, and where some of history's most unlikely figures shaped the destinies of nations. Let us begin at the beginning, in the ancient world, where eunuchs first appeared in the records of kings. When we look for the first traces of eunuchs in human history, we find ourselves in the cradle of civilization, Mesopotamia. The great river valleys of the Tigris and Euphrates gave rise to mighty empires. Sumer, Akkad, Assyria, Babylon. Their kings ruled with divine authority. Their palaces teemed with servants and scribes, and their temples stood as symbols of heavenly order brought to earth. And within this world of rigid hierarchy and constant intrigue, the earliest eunuchs appear. The term itself, eunuch, comes much later from the Greek eunuchos, meaning guardian of the bed. But the practice predates the word. In the records of Assyrians and Babylonians, we hear of men who were set apart, entrusted with the care of royal households, and who, through castration, became safe custodians of power. For rulers, the logic was simple, if brutal. A man without the capacity to father children would not start a dynasty of his own. He posed no threat to the king's bloodline. He could be trusted to guard the harem, to watch over the queen and concubines, and to serve loyally without divided interests. The annals of Assyrian kings describe officials in their palaces who matched this role. They appear not as warriors, not as common slaves, but as high-ranking servants whose loyalty was prized above all. When Assyrian relief even showed attendants beside the throne, whose colors believe were eunuchs, their smooth faces carved without beards, a possible sign of castration. Later, interpreters would call them eunuchs, noting their special proximity to royal women and their trusted access to private chambers. Some historians even suggest that Daniel, the Hebrew youth taken into Babylonian service, may have been made a eunuch when brought into the king's court, as was customary for foreign boys, selected for royal training. What began as a cruel solution to palace security soon became an institution. Eunuchs were not merely bodyguards. They were bureaucrats, counselors, and keepers of secrets. Because they could not build families of their own, their fortunes were tied entirely to the king. This made them, at least in theory, incorruptible. And yet, history shows us the irony. In removing their power to reproduce, kings often handed them the power to rule. By the time the Persian Empire rose under Cyrus and Darius, the system was already entrenched. Eunuchs became the stewards of harems that housed hundreds of women. They controlled access to the monarch, making them gatekeepers of power itself. The Greek historian Herodotus wrote of this men with a mix of fascination and suspicion, noting how Persians relied upon castrated servants from conquered lands. Choosing eunuchs of foreign race or distant province was no accident. A man severed from family ties, tribe, and the possibility of heirs was thought to be the most loyal. For where else could his ambition find root, except in the shadow of his master? We must pause here to imagine the personal cost. The boys who became eunuchs in Mesopotamia and Persia were rarely volunteers. They were captives of war, slaves bought in markets, or children given up by desperate families, hoping to gain favor in the palace. The decision was almost never their own. To many ancient rulers, they were both tools and symbols. Tools of control within the palace, and symbols of king's power over the very bodies of his subjects. And yet, the paradox emerges even in these earliest centuries. Some eunuchs began as slaves, but rose to command armies, manage treasuries, and whisper counsel into royal ears. They had no children to carry their name, but their deeds shaped the destinies of nations. They were meteorited to be made powerless, and yet, again and again, they proved to be indispensable wielders of influence. From Mesopotamia to Persia, the role of eunuchs expanded, spreading like a strange cultural thread that wove itself through empires. When Alexander the Great swept through the East, he encountered eunuchs at every level of Persian governance. His own successors adopted the practice, and through them, the tradition passed into the Hellenistic world. By the time Rome rose to dominance, eunuchs were already seen as an Eastern phenomenon, foreign, exotic, and yet strangely necessary in the machinery of empire. So we see, from their first recorded mentions, eunuchs were never simply servants. They were guardians, mediators, and power brokers. Their origins in the courts of Mesopotamia and Persia set the stage for a role that would stretch across continents and endure for millennia. In the next part of our journey, we will pause to ask the most basic and haunting questions. Why would boys become eunuchs at all? Was it always forced upon them? Or did some willingly accept this path? And what could possibly motivate families to surrender their sons to such a fate? To understand the eunuch system, we must ask a question, both haunting and practical. Why would boys become eunuchs in the first place? For most, the answer is brutally simple. They did not choose. They were chosen. In the ancient world, conquest filled the markets with captives. Boys torn from their villages, marched in chains, sold in bazaars from Babylon to Byzantium. Some of these boys were singled out, not to serve as ordinary slaves, but to be transformed into something else. The castration knife awaited them. Why? Because eunuchs commanded higher prices. A slave merchant could double, even triple his profit by selling a boy who had been castrated. Eunuchs were rare commodities, useful only to the wealthy and powerful, but so trusted in palaces and temples that the demand never ceased. For some merchants, the practice was simply business, the cruel arithmetic of supply and demand. Conquerors, too, used castration as a tool of control. A rival prince or young noble might be mutilated so that he could serve without even threatening the victor's throne. By stripping him of lineage, they stripped him of ambition. What might have been a challenger became a servant. And yet, not all eunuchs began in chains. In some cultures, poor families offered their sons willingly. Imagine a peasant father, unable to feed his children, seeing in the palace a chance for survival. A son made a eunuch might live in comfort, dress in silk, and rise to high office. He could send money home, perhaps even secure his family's safety. The choice was tragic, but to some, it was a choice between a life of poverty and a life of possibility. In Ming China, records tell of parents who presented their sons for castration, hoping they would find a place within the forbidden city. In the Ottoman Empire, African boys were often handed over by local chiefs, sometimes under pressure, sometimes in hope of royal favor. There were also those who, astonishingly, sought castration themselves. For a boy born into slavery, the path to power was narrow. But as a eunuch, he might rise above ordinary slaves, even above freemen, and stand at the side of kings. In China, some men castrated themselves, often in secret, using crude tools, before presenting themselves at the palace gates with their severed genitals preserved in a box. Without proof of the act, they would be rejected. With it, they could enter a world close to other men. Even in Byzantium, some ambitious men embraced the knife, reasoning that the loss of manhood was a small price for the gain of imperial power. To a desperate or ambitious youth, the promise of influence could outweigh the cost. In rare cases, castration was not about palace service, but about spiritual devotion. Certain sects in the ancient world believed that sexuality was a chain binding the soul. In pursuit of purity, some men chose to castrate themselves, offering their bodies as proof of devotion. Early Christianity, too, carried echoes of this idea. The Gospel of Matthew records Jesus speaking of eunuchs who have made themselves eunuchs for the sake of the kingdom of heaven. While most interpreters see this as symbolic, some took it literally. The church father, Origen of Alexandria, according to legend, castrated himself in youthful zeal, though later generations condemned the act. For these men, castration was not forced by kings, but embraced for God, a sacrifice of the flesh for the promise of holiness. Still, for most, the lure was neither spiritual nor voluntary. It was a glimmer of wealth, power, and survival. Eunuchs often outlived ordinary servants. They became confidants, treasurers, even generals. In a society where a poor boy might otherwise toil in obscurity, the path of the eunuch led straight to the palace. And so, across cultures, across centuries, the reasons converged. Conquest, slavery, ambition, desperation, faith. Each boy's story was different, yet the end was the same. They were led to the place of cutting. They were prepared for the operation that would sever their past and open the way to a new identity. And so we arrive at the darkest part of this journey. We must face the unflinching reality of the knife, the castration itself. In the next chapter, we will explore the process, the methods, the dangers, and the brutal transformation that turn boys into eunuchs. To say that eunuchs were made by castration is true, but it is not the whole truth. The act of cutting was only the first threshold, the bloody gate. Beyond it lay an entire world of initiation, training, and hierarchy that shaped a boy into one of the most trusted, often feared, figures in the palace. Let us begin with the ordeal itself, the castration process. There was no single method. Across cultures and centuries, castration varied. The mildest form was the removal of the testes alone. Painful, dangerous, but survivable. Boys castrated this way could still urinate normally, and often retained partial sexual function. These were known in Latin as spadones. The more extreme method, practiced in China and in parts of the Islamic world, was complete emasculation, removal of both testicles and the penis. This was called the total cut. The wound was sealed with cauterization or packed with herbs, leaving only a small hole for urination. Survival rates were grim. 1 in 3 might die from shock, blood loss, or infection. Age was crucial. The younger the boy, the easier it was for the body to adapt. Prepubescent boys, cut before their voices deepened, developed the smooth faces, high-pitched voices, and long limbs, often associated with eunuchs. Older men faced greater risks and fewer benefits. The instruments were crude: knives, shards of pottery, heated metal. The pain was unimaginable. Some accounts describe boys being submerged waist-deep in hot sand after the cut to stop the bleeding. Others were force-fed opium or wine to dull the agony. Who forgot the day of their making? But survival meant transformation. The boy was now set apart, his future irrevocably tied to the palace. After recovery, the boy's journey was not over. To serve as a eunuch, he had to prove he had been truly castrated. In China, this proof was chillingly literal. The severed genitals, known as the precious treasure, were preserved in a wooden box. A eunuch carried this box with him all his life, for without it, he could not receive an honorable burial. At death, the treasure would be placed back with the body, restoring him symbolically in the afterlife. In the Ottoman Empire, inspection was physical. Senior eunuchs examined the new recruit to confirm his condition. Any man found faking was executed. For to infiltrate the harem under false pretenses was the gravest of crimes. Once verified, the boy was officially enrolled into the palace service. He was no longer merely a castrated slave. He was part of a brotherhood, an institution that spanned centuries. What awaited him inside? Training. For eunuchs were not merely guards. They were administrators, companions, and power brokers. To serve effectively, they required discipline, literacy, and knowledge of court rituals. In China's Forbidden City, new eunuchs were given years of instruction. They learned to read and write, to keep records, to perform the endless rituals of court life. They practiced silence, obedience, and the art of moving unseen. Their days were filled with drills in etiquette, how to bow, how to speak to the emperor, how to carry a lantern or present food. In Byzantium, palace eunuchs were trained not only in ceremony, but in theology. Many served as church singers or liturgical assistants. Their high voices prized in sacred music. Others were drilled in military tactics, rising to become generals despite their condition. In the Ottoman court, African boys, frustrated in childhood, were sent first to schools within the palace. They memorized the Quran, learned languages, and mastered the intricate hierarchy of harem protocol. The brightest advanced to positions of astonishing influence. The duller or weaker became simple guards. Thus, the palace shaped each eunuch according to his talents. Some remained at the lowest level, carrying trays or sweeping floors. Others, with sharp minds and political instinct, climbed step by step toward the inner chambers of power. The eunuch system was not a flat world. It was a pyramid. At the base were the novices, still learning their place. Above them, the attendants, each assigned to a master. An imperial prince, a noble lady, a general. Their loyalty was to this master, but ultimately to the throne. Higher still were the stewards, men trusted with keys, scrolls, and coffers. They guarded documents, treasures, and secrets. At the very top stood the grand eunuchs, chief eunuch of the harem in Persia, Takizla Ragasi in Ottoman Istanbul, the director of eunuchs in China's palace. These men were second only to the sovereign himself in influence. They controlled access, decided who saw the ruler, and often whispered into his ear. In their hands, the fate of empires were decided. It was a strange ladder to climb, one that began in blood and ended, for a few, in splendor. Thus, to become a eunuch was not merely to lose one's manhood. It was to enter an order, a system, a way of life with rules, discipline, and rewards. From the moment of castration to the moment he bowed before his first master, the boy was being remade from ordinary human into instrument of empire. But the paradox remains. For all this suffering, some eunuchs rose higher than any free man could dream. Their loyalty, their separation from family, and their sheer usefulness placed them at the very heart of power. In our next chapter, we will ask, What did they gain in return? What benefits, privileges, and riches awaited those who survived the knife and the training? What was the prize at the end of this perilous road? After the knife, after the long years of training and obedience, what awaited the eunuch? For many, it was a life of luxury unimaginable to the ordinary man. To understand why eunuchs endured, and sometimes even chose, this fate, we must look at the extraordinary rewards they could reap. Power in the ancient world often depended on one thing: access. Who could approach the king? Who could enter the queen's chambers? Who could whisper counsel into the ear of the emperor? Eunuchs stood at the doorway to power itself. In Persia, no one saw the great king without passing through eunuchs. In China's Forbidden City, the emperor was surrounded by thousands of attendants, but only eunuchs had the right to cross certain thresholds. In the Ottoman Topkapi Palace, the chief black eunuch decided which petitions reached the Sultan. In societies where rulers were cloaked in mystery and seclusion, the man who controlled access controlled the state. Eunuchs were not kings themselves, but they were often gatekeepers of kingship. Why distrust? Because eunuchs had no heirs. A general or minister with sons might plot rebellion, dreaming of founding a dynasty. A eunuch, castrated and cut off from family, had no such future. His only power was borrowed, dependent entirely on its master's favor. This made eunuchs uniquely safe, or so rulers believed. And in that safety lay immense opportunity. For while other officials were always under suspicion, eunuchs could slip into the role of confidant, counselor, even friend. With power came wealth. Eunuchs received salaries, gifts, and estates. In China, senior eunuchs amassed fortunes rivaling nobles. They owned land, collected rents, and built lavish mansions. In the Byzantine court, eunuchs controlled treasuries, giving them ample chance to skim or redirect funds. In the Ottoman Empire, the chief black eunuch received a cut from imperial endowments, growing fabulously rich. Even those of lesser rank enjoyed privileges. Fine clothing, silks, jewelry, and rich food were common in palace life. Some eunuchs became patrons of the arts, sponsoring monasteries, theaters, or naval expeditions. Zhang Hai, the great Ming admiral, commanded treasure fleets that carried unimaginable wealth. And though he had no children to inherit it, his name and deeds resounded across continents. But oath was only one side of the coin. Influence was the other. Eunuchs could make or break careers. They whispered in the ruler's ear, controlled the flow of information, and decided who gained an audience. A eunuch's favor could launch a man into command, while his disfavor could ruin him. Some eunuchs became kingmakers outright. In Byzantium, eunuchs crowned emperors and deposed them. In China, factions of eunuchs and scholars battled for the emperor's ear, sometimes with bloodshed. In the Ottoman court, the chief black eunuch wielded such authority over the harem and the religious endowments that he often was shown the Grand Vizier. What began as a condition of servitude could transform into one of mastery. Beyond wealth and politics, eunuchs also enjoyed privileges denied to ordinary men. They lived inside the most forbidden spaces: the harem, the imperial apartments, the inner sanctuaries of temples. They ate at royal tables, traveled with armies, and handled sacred relics. Some enjoyed companionship and intimacy with queens and concubines, not in the sexual sense, but as confidants. To be trusted by women of the court was no small advantage, for their influence often rivaled the men's. In some cases, rumors spread of eunuchs who broke the rules, engaging in hidden affairs despite their condition. Such stories, whether true or not, only added to their mystique. And yet, their position was fragile. For all their riches and influence, eunuchs remained utterly dependent. Their power existed only as long as their master lived, or as long as they retained favor. A single word from the ruler could strip them of everything. This paradox defined eunuch life: absolute proximity to power, absolute vulnerability to its whims. Some navigated this tension brilliantly, surviving reign after reign, amassing fortunes that outlived them. Others, hugely, accused of corruption, executed by jealous rivals, or cast out of disgrace. One haunting question remains: what legacy could a eunuch leave when he had no sons to inherit his wealth, no bloodline to continue his name? The answer varied. Many adopted nephews or protégés, pouring their fortunes into them. Others endowed temples, monasteries, or mosques, leaving their names carved into stone. Some, like Zhangha, etched their legacy into history itself through daring voyages and statecraft. Though cut off from family, eunuchs found other ways to become immortal. Thus we see, the rewards of eunuchhood were immense. Palaces glittered with silk, gold, and jewels, and within them, eunuchs moved as both servants and masters. Their lives were marked by suffering, but also by privilege. It is no wonder, then, that, despite the pain of castration, despite the stigma, the system endured for millennia. For the price of manhood, eunuchs purchased a ticket into the most powerful courts on earth. But were they only political creatures driven by ambition? Or were they still human, capable of love, longing, and intimacy? In our next chapter, we turn from palaces and politics to the private lives of eunuchs. Did they fall in love? Did they marry? And how did they find companionship in a world that had marked them as different forever? When we think of eunuchs, we often imagine them only as palace officials, political manipulators, or guardians of harems. But behind the silk robes and political intrigue, they were still human, with hearts that could ache, longings that could steer, and a need for companionship that no knife could get away. So what did their private lives look like? Could eunuchs fall in love? Could they marry? And if so, with whom? Eunuchs occupied a strange place in society, neither fully men in the eyes of their culture, nor women, nor children. They were outsiders. This status was both a curse and a strange kind of freedom. On one hand, their lack of normal family ties set them apart. They were mocked, distrusted, or pitied by ordinary people. On the other hand, their detachment from conventional gender roles sometimes allowed them to move in both male and female worlds. They could be confidants to women in the harem, advisors to kings, even spiritual leaders in temples. But at the heart of their existence lay the same question all humans face. Who will love me? Did eunuchs fall in love? The answer is yes. History is full of eunuchs who formed deep attachments. Some fell in love with women, concubines, servants, even noble ladies. Though they were presumed safe, scandals erupted from time to time. In China's Ming dynasty, certain eunuchs were accused of secret affairs with palace women. In the Byzantine Empire, stories spread of eunuchs who engaged in intimate relationships, often in defiance of strict rules. Others formed bonds with men. In societies where same-sex love was stigmatized, eunuchs sometimes occupied a gray zone. Their ambiguous status gave cover for relationships that might otherwise have been forbidden. Ottoman and Persian poetry hints at tender bonds between male attendants and eunuchs. Not every story is sexual. Many eunuchs sought companionship in the friendships, spiritual brotherhoods, or mentorship of younger protégés. But love, in all its forms, were undeniably present. In some cultures, eunuchs could even marry. In Byzantium, there are records of eunuchs entering legal marriages, especially if they held high court positions and wished for the respectability that came with a household. Though consummation might not have been possible, companionship and political alliances mattered more. In China, low-ranking eunuchs sometimes married servant women, forming households within or near palace grounds. These marriages often functioned as partnerships. The eunuch brought income and security. The wife provided care, and sometimes the couple adopted children to carry on their name. Adoption was particularly common. A eunuch might adopt nephews, cousins, or even unrelated boys. Through adoption, he gained a filial piety denied to him by his condition. His wealth, reputation, and memory could live on. Yet we must not romanticize too much. For every eunuch who found love or companionship, countless others lived in isolation. Many were forbidden to marry. Many were mocked, called half-men or cut ones. Some lived their entire lives inside palace walls. Their only relationships, those of service and hierarchy. Writers of the time often described eunuchs as bitter, jealous, or scheming. These stereotypes probably grew from their loneliness, from the frustration of being cut off from ordinary family life. Imagine living surrounded by beauty, wealth, and intimacy in the harem, but always excluded from it. Desire without fulfillment could easily turn into resentment. Still, scandals broke out. One Ming eunuch was accused of secretly fathering children, suggesting either that his castration was incomplete or faked. In Ottoman courts, whispers told of concubines smuggling eunuchs into their chambers for illicit affection. In Byzantium, eunuchs were sometimes suspected of seducing empresses for noble women, though such charges may have been political slander. These tales reveal not only human desire, but also the constant tension between the image of the eunuch as safe and the reality that they were still men capable of love and intimacy, in whatever form it took. And here lies another twist. Not all eunuchs were truly castrated. Some men faked the procedure or underwent only partial castration, allowing them to function sexually. This made them especially dangerous in the eyes of rulers, for a eunuch who could enter the harem and still perform as a man was a threat to dynasties. Whether rare or exaggerated, such stories fuel both fascination and fear. They remind us that the line between myth and reality in eunuch's life was often blurred. Ultimately, the private lives of eunuchs remind us that beneath the politics, beneath the silks and gold, they were human beings seeking the same things we all seek: love, companionship, and remembrance. Some found it in secret lovers, some in formal marriages, some in spiritual devotion or art, others in adoption and mentorship, and many, perhaps most, lived in silence, carrying their longings alone. Their bodies had been altered, but their hearts still beat with human desire. So when we look at the eunuch, let us not see only a functionary or a historical curiosity. Let us see a man caught between worlds, deprived of one future, yet carving out another. And as history shows us, love was a way of breaking through, even in the most forbidden of places. Up to this point, we've spoken of eunuchs as an institution, as a collective presence across empires. But history is not made of institutions alone. It is made of people. And among eunuchs, some rose far beyond the palace gates, leaving their names carved into the annals of history. These are the eunuchs whose power rivaled kings, whose ambition reshaped empires, and whose lives remind us that even from the margins, one can command the center. Let us begin with Bagovas, the Persian eunuch of the 4th century BCE. Bagovas began as a court servant of King Artaxerxes III, but soon became his closest confidant. When Artaxerxes displeased him, Bagovas allegedly poisoned him and placed Arses, the king's son, on the throne. When Arses, too, resisted his control, Bagovas murdered him as well, and then elevated Darius III, the last Achaemenid king. Greek historians portray Bagovas as both sinister and brilliant, a manipulator of thrones, feared even by kings. When Alexander the Great defeated Persia, he captured Bagovas, but feared this life. Some sources even claim Bagoas became Alexander's favorite companion. Whether villain or survivor, Bagoas remained the archetype of the eunuch as kingmaker, powerless in body, yet wielding powers over empires. In Byzantium, eunuchs were not only courtiers but also warriors. None proved this more than Narses, the 6th century eunuch who served under Emperor Justinian. Despite being nearly 70 years old and having no military training, Narses was appointed general during the Gothic War in Italy. Against all odds, he defeated the Ostrogoths at the Battle of Tagine, restoring Italy to the Byzantine Empire. Narses showed that a eunuch, barred from marriage and heirs, could nonetheless command armies and win glory on the battlefield. His victories proved that castration did not erase intelligence, courage, and ambition. No list of eunuchs is complete without Wei Zhongshan, the most notorious eunuch of Ming China. Rising from humble beginnings, Wei gained the trust of the Changqi emperor in the early 17th century. Soon, he controlled the entire court. He exiled or executed scholars who opposed him, filled the bureaucracy with his allies, and demanded temples be built in his honor. Wei Zhongshan ruled as a dictator in all but name, terrorizing ministers and enriching himself. But when the emperor died, his enemies struck back. The new regime forced Wei to commit suicide, and his name became a byword for corruption and tyranny. Wei's story illustrates the danger of eunuchs unchecked. Servants who became masters, remembered more for fear than loyalty. Not all famous eunuchs were tyrants. Some were innovators. In the Han Dynasty of China, the eunuch, Tai Lu, changed the world by perfecting the process of making paper in the 2nd century CE. His invention transformed education, religion, and government, allowing text to be copied cheaply and knowledge to spread far more widely than before. Today, every book, every printed page owes something to Kai Lun, the eunuch whose name still stands in history as the father of paper. In Istanbul, the position of Kisler Agassi, or chief black eunuch, became so powerful that individual names sometimes faded into the office itself. But a few stand out. One was Mehmet Aga, who served in the early 17th century. He controlled access to the harem and managed vast religious endowments. Another, Bishir Aga, ruled as one of the most powerful men of the 18th century, directing imperial policy and enriching himself in the process. The chief black eunuchs remind us that in the Ottoman world, a man born enslaved in Africa, castrated against his will, could nonetheless rise to a position of unimaginable power, shaping dynasties and controlling wealth that rivaled viziers. In India, eunuchs like Ithir Khan served the Mughal emperors, rising to command armies and hold higher office. In Byzantium, eunuchs like Joseph Bringas and Basil Lycopenos ruled as de facto prime ministers, deciding imperial policy. In Ethiopia, Eunuchs even became bishops, leading the church with full authority despite their altered state. These men, Begwos the kingmaker, Narcissus the general, Wei Zhongjun the tyrant, Tai Lun the innovator, and the chief black eunuchs of the Ottomans, show us the many faces of the eunuch. Some schemed, some built, some ruled, and some destroyed. But all proved that even those cast aside by violence could rise to the very center of history. The eunuch was not simply a victim, not simply a servant. In their lives, we see both tragedy and triumph, corruption and creation. They were, above all, survivors, and in surviving, they shaped empires. Every empire rises, and every empire falls. The story of eunuchs is no different. For centuries, they stood as indispensable figures in the courts of kings and emperors. But by the dawn of the modern age, their influence had faded, their roles abolished, and their legacy relegated to memory. Why did eunuchs decline? What ended a tradition that spanned from the palaces of Persia to the forbidden city of Beijing? And how do we remember them today? In China, eunuchs were at their zenith during the Ming Dynasty, but their rise brought corruption and chaos. Wei Zhongzhan, as we discussed earlier, symbolized everything critics feared about eunuchs: unchecked power, brutality, and greed. After his death, the backlash against eunuchs intensified. When the Ming Dynasty collapsed in the mid-17th century, many blamed the corruption of eunuchs for the downfall. The succeeding Qing dynasty sharply restricted their number and influence. By the late 19th century, eunuchs had been reduced to ceremonial servants, shadows of their former selves. Finally, with the fall of the Qing in 1911, the institution of Polish eunuchs was abolished entirely. The last imperial eunuch, Sun Yao-ting, lived until 1996, a living reminder of a vanished world. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs had long been fixtures of both church and state. But as the empire declined under Ottoman pressure, so too did their role. By the 11th and 12th centuries, eunuchs were less central to politics. The rise of professional bureaucrats and military aristocracy diminished their importance. By the fall of Constantinople in 1453, eunuchs still existed, but the age when they could make or unmake emperors was long past. The Ottoman Empire clung to eunuchs longer than most. The chief black eunuch of the harem remained a towering figure even into the 19th century. But modernization brought change. Sultans, seeking to reform their empire and align with European powers, viewed the harem system and the eunuchs who guarded it as outdated. By the mid-1800s, during the Tanzimat reforms, the power of the chief black eunuch was steadily curtailed. By the early 20th century, eunuchs had disappeared from Ottoman service altogether. In Mughal India, eunuchs declined after the empire's collapse in the 18th century. Some continued in local courts, but British colonial rule regarded them as exotic relics, not state officials. In Ethiopia, the tradition of eunuchs in church and court slowly disappeared with moderate reforms in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In Korea and Vietnam, palace eunuchs persisted into the 1800s, but modernization and Western pressure eventually brought the roles to an end. Why did eunuchs vanish after holding power for so long? Several forces converged. Modern armies and bureaucracies. The rise of professional institutions meant rulers no longer relied on eunuchs to fill sensitive posts. Changing morality. As global attitudes toward bodily mutilation shifted, castration was increasingly condemned as barbaric. Western influence, colonization, and modernization movements imported European norms, which saw eunuchs as symbols of decadence and Oriental despotism. Backlash against corruption. In many empires, eunuchs had become scapegoats for decline. Their removal was framed as a step towards renewal. Though eunuchs disappeared from courts, their presence lingers in memory and culture. In Chinese opera and literature, eunuchs are often portrayed as cunning villains, scheming courtiers who whispered in emperors' ears. In Western imagination, especially during the 18th and 19th centuries, they became symbols of exotic East, mysterious guardians of harms. In music, the castrati singers of Europe represented a different but related phenomenon: the use of gutturation to produce otherworldly voices, a reminder of our society's once prized altered bodies for specific roles. Most strikingly, eunuchs continue to appear in modern storytelling, from novels and films to fantasy epics like Game of Thrones, where the eunuch varies, echoes many of the traits seen in real history: loyalty, cunning, ambition, and survival. The eunuchs are gone now. No empire today requires men to be unmade in order to serve. But their story is not forgotten. They remind us of the strange bargains societies once struck in pursuit of loyalty, control, and power. They remind us that history is not only about kings and generals, but about those whose bodies were shaped by the demands of empire. The eunuchs are silent today, but their legacy speaks in paper and music, in the ruins of palaces, and in the echoes of stories told across the world. Their time is ended, but their story still asks us, what would you give up for power? And what does it mean to belong when even your body is not your own? The story of eunuchs is not just about mutilation or palace intrigue. It is, at its core, about power. How it is gained, how it is kept, and what people are willing to sacrifice to stand near it. For more than 2,000 years, boys were taken from villages, sold by their families, or offered themselves willingly, knowing that the price of entering the inner sanctum of an empire was their own bodies. Some gained wealth, titles, and honor. Others faded into obscurity. Servants remembered only as shadows in the palace's they guarded. But the paradox of eunuchs is haunting. They were trusted because they had been broken. They were allowed near the most intimate circles of rulers precisely because their humanity had been altered. And yet, in so many cases, they turned that loss into influence, crafting lives of immense importance. Their story asks uncomfortable questions. How far will societies go to preserve dynasties and control desire? What does loyalty mean when it is forced by the knife? And what does it mean to belong when your body no longer defines you as it once did? Today, we no longer make eunuchs, but we still wrestle with the same question of power and control. Who gets access to leaders? Who can be trusted with secrets? Who must give up part of themselves to succeed? In the eunuchs, history shows us both cruelty and resilience, oppression and ambition. They remind us that history is not only written by kings and emperors, but also by those whose lives were shaped by the harsh demands of empire. Men who were not quite men, yet never fully aroused. Their voices may be faint, carried to us only through chronicles and ruins, but their story endures, whispering to us across centuries. Power always has a cost, and sometimes that cost is paid with the body itself.